Hi, Dr. Watson here. Musicians and especially composers are some of the most colorful people I know. There are some pretty visible examples of classical musicians who get into some pretty bizarre and even downright deplorable situations in their personal life. In this video, which I'm calling The Bad Boys of Classical Music, I've decided to focus on a couple infamous artist-musicians whose excellence in music doesn't seem to carry over to their personal life. Let's begin in the late Renaissance with the Italian nobleman and composer Carlo Gesualdo. As a prince and count, Gesualdo apparently had a lot of leisure time on his hands, time he spent writing some of the most progressive and edgy madrigals of his day. And because of his financial resources, he could hire singers and instrumentalists to come on over to his castle and perform his music. His music used a lot of chromaticism and dissonance that wouldn't really show up in other composers' music until the 19th century. Gesualdo was for his day what we'd call an avant-garde composer. But Gesualdo was also a jealous man with a bad temper. A terrible combination, to be sure. One fine October in 1590, Gesualdo left his wife at the castle to go on a hunting trip. But suspecting his wife of infidelity, he doubled back and literally walked in on his wife and her lover, doing what lovers do. Gesualdo may have considered his options, such as divorce or challenging this rival to a duel, but instead he settled upon the rather extreme solution of stabbing his wife and her lover multiple times, then shooting the lover, then dressing the lover in women's clothing. Amazingly, as a nobleman, Gesualdo was immune from prosecution. I first heard this bizarre story in sort of an unusual circumstance. As a doctoral student at Temple University in the 90s, I had to pass a foreign language translation test. Proctoring my exam was Temple professor and composer Matthew Greenbaum. He gave me several paragraphs from a French musical encyclopedia that gave the account. I guess I hadn't encountered idioms in French for caught in the act, or numerous stab wounds, or double murder, and therefore I failed the exam. Luckily, when I took the test a few months later, I did pass. There's actually much more to the Gesualdo story, but we must move on to our next bad boy, the Italian violin virtuoso and composer Nicolo Paganini. Paganini was a child prodigy initially taught by his father, kind of like Mozart. He was wowing audiences in his hometown of Genoa before the turn of the 19th century and was conquering Europe into the 1800s. He was so gifted that he could scarcely find a teacher to show him anything, and he began writing his own pieces to challenge and showcase his amazing technique. The musical impact of Paganini's virtuosity not only extended the violin technique of soloists for years to come, but it greatly influenced the approach to virtuosic expression in the music of composers like Chopin and Liszt. Again, like Mozart, Paganini's father was rather authoritarian, so at the age of 16, making enough money concertizing to support himself, the young virtuoso left home. Sadly, like too many of today's cash cow teen celebrities, the life of touring and stardom led to excesses. Paganini became quite a womanizer and a gambler. Paganini's exploits include shacking up with an older mistress and several times having to pawn his own violin to pay gambling debts. Listen to this description by Liszt biographer Alan Walker. Paganini was addicted to the gaming tables and would often gamble the night away in darkened, smoke-filled rooms with bizarre characters from the underworld as his opponents, making and losing whole fortunes on the spin of a wheel or the turn of a card. He would emerge from these hellholes blinking in the morning sunlight, half drugged from alcohol and datura cigars, the only oral palliatives strong enough to dull the pain in his rotting jawbone, and go straight to the concert hall in the crumpled, stale-smelling evening suit he had worn all night. Lots of fun, huh? Well, I think the most sensational story told about Paganini is that he sold his soul to the devil in exchange for his wondrous talent. Of course, this is more Paganini legend than truth, but I think it's obvious that being the best violinist of your generation doesn't necessarily guarantee a life of joy and contentment. Next, we move to one of the largest musical personalities of all time, the 19th century German composer of opera on the grandest scale, Richard Wagner. In 1876, audiences from all over Europe descended on the small Bavarian town of Bayreuth to sit in the newly constructed Festspielhaus to hear the much-anticipated premiere of Wagner's now legendary The Ring of the Nibelung. The Ring, or Ring Cycle as it is also known, is a set of 4 vocally demanding, full-length operas accompanied by a gargantuan orchestra meant to be performed together as a group to tell the story of the Germanic people's mythology. The operas in the Ring are Das Rheingold, or The Rheingold, Die Walküre, or The Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung, or Twilight of the Gods. Wagner labored almost single-mindedly on this project for about 26 years, writing both the libretto, which is the lyrics, and the music. He felt that no existing opera house could play host to the theatrical and musical effects he envisioned, so he had the Festspielhaus at Bayreuth specifically constructed for these operas. The majority of financing for both Wagner's creative work and the construction of the then state-of-the-art opera house at Bayreuth came from the personal fortune of the eccentric king of Bavaria, Ludwig II. Ludwig, sometimes known as Mad King Ludwig, also built many lavish fantasy castles, borrowing so heavily to fund these pet projects that his ministers eventually conspired to depose him on grounds that he was insane. But let's flash back a few decades earlier to Dresden, where a young Wagner, like his later patron, the Mad King, had problems of his own. Wagner's marriage to Minna Planner, a pretty actress he met conducting, was falling apart. On top of that, he could barely stay one step ahead of his creditors, and he had gotten involved with an anti-government revolutionary movement. Because of the latter, he ended up having to flee Dresden and remained in exile for 12 years. Destitute and with his marriage on the rocks, Wagner did what any reasonable man would do. He poured himself into his work and had an affair with a married poet named Matilda Wiesendank. Some of the very important work that kept Wagner from dealing with his personal problems included writing many essays on musical aesthetics, conceiving and beginning the libretto for the Ring Cycle, and working on a couple of other operas. Wagner's wife Minna eventually found out about his affair, and their marriage dissolved. But back home, things cooled down politically, so Wagner was allowed to return from exile. It's about then that Mad King Ludwig ascended to the throne at the young age of 18. He was so infatuated with Wagner's music and aura that he settled all of his debts and funded his new opera, Tristan und Isolde, which was premiered in 1865. The conductor of this opera, Hans von Bülow, had a pretty wife named Cosima, who was 24 years younger than good old Wagner. Hans and Cosima had a baby girl named Isolde that very year. Unfortunately, as it turns out, Isolde was really Wagner's daughter. Yep, Wagner had done it again, another affair. Interestingly, Cosima was the illegitimate daughter of composer Franz Liszt, who had a mistress himself. Oy vey, what a complicated lot these romantic composers were. Amazingly, Wagner and Cosima had 2 more illegitimate children before Cosima divorced von Bülow. I think Wagner deserves to be among our rogues gallery of classical musicians based solely upon his philandering. But if that wasn't enough, there is the issue of his documented anti-Semitism. In an 1850 pamphlet called Jewishness in Music, Wagner called Jews a harmful and alien element in German culture, stating that the German people were repelled by their alien appearance and behavior, and further accusing their music of being superficial and aimed only at commercial rather than artistic success. Some have defended the composer, debating what Wagner actually meant, but sadly, Wagner's sentiments and music turned out to be appropriated by Adolf Hitler during his reign of terror. Well, let's lighten up our discussion by turning to a composer who, like his Impressionist painter contemporary Monet, was very interested in light. Of course, I am referring to Claude Debussy. I might make a case for Debussy as a bad boy because he was known for being argumentative, with both his teachers and the institutions at which he studied. But it was his compositional freedom and experimenting that led to the timbrally evocative musical impressionism we associate with him. But I think we can give Debussy the award for even out-womanizing Wagner. Let's see if we can condense his exploits. Well, beginning at age 18, he had an 8-year affair with the wife of a Parisian lawyer. Then he shacked up with a tailor's daughter named Gaby Dupont for 9 years. During that time, he cheated on Gaby with a singer, Thérèse Roger, to whom he was briefly engaged. Then he moved on to a friend of Gaby's, the fashion model Lily Texier, and actually married her. Irritated with her intellectual limitations, though, he left Texier in 1904 for the wife of a Paris banker, Emma Bardac, who was also incidentally the mother of one of Debussy's students. Oh, one more thing. So distraught were both Gaby Dupont and Lily Texier at being abandoned by Debussy that each of them tried to commit suicide, Texier shooting herself in the chest in the middle of a public square in Paris. It seems the composer who was so deft and subtle in orchestrating colorful chords was as clumsy as an ox in love. And that brings us to the last of the bad boys of classical music that I've selected for this episode. New Jersey-born George Antheil, a composer, pianist, author, and inventor working in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, it was from the title of Antheil's 1945 autobiography, Bad Boy of Music, that I derived the title for this episode. George Antheil, like the futurist painters and writers of his day, was influenced by the movement and sounds of the industrial age. His music is aggressive, percussive, and mechanical sounding, and he has been accused of hitting rather than playing the piano. His futurist approach led him to use such unconventional percussion instruments as a siren and an engine. Antheil played the piano with such percussive force that he sometimes injured himself. But at least the loud playing drowned out the heckling he often drew from audience members. But I doubt he minded the jeering. He seems to be a public relations pioneer of the technique of crafting and using a bad boy persona to foist his career. Examples of this include a riot with hooting and hollering and fighting in the aisles that broke out in the middle of a concert of Antheil's music in Paris. Musicians Eric Satie and Darius Milhaud, and artist Pablo Picasso, as well as many other of Paris' culture elite, were on hand. There is some speculation that the mayhem may have been contrived since a film crew was on hand to capture the proceedings. While concertizing in Budapest, apparently, Antheil pulled a pistol from his jacket and set it on the piano to encourage the audience to listen. Before the premiere of his most famous work, the Ballet Mécanique, he is reported to have engineered his own disappearance while on a visit to Africa, all to generate hype. Despite his self-promoting antics, George Antheil and his music are worth checking out. Besides his concert music, he wrote for film and TV, and was a columnist for several magazines and authored a few books. His most far-flung endeavor is probably the torpedo guidance system, based on a player piano mechanism designed by him and German actress Hedy Lamarr. I know, crazy, right? You'll just have to check it out. I know it's a lot of fun to hear about the bad boys of music, but I hope you won't judge all composers by the quirks of a few. Sure, music has its Antheils and Debussys and Wagners, but it also has its Bachs and Handels, and Jack Redford, a name you may not know, though you've probably heard his music for film. One of the lessons that music teaches us is that there is great satisfaction to be found when you devote yourself to something larger than yourself. I'd be willing to bet that the bad boys of music were devoted to music with a capital M, and that their passion for art distracted them from some other, I'd say, more important things, such as fidelity and family. Another lesson that music teaches is the value of diversity, how those who are different make a valuable contribution, and certainly Western culture is richer because of the contributions of these bad boys. I guess I'm saying that while I wouldn't want to be Debussy's spouse, I'm blessed immensely by his music. However, we have to keep things in perspective about what is most important in life. To make my argument, I'd like to bring the discussion to our current time. Just say I am married with children trying to break into the world of composing for film. There is only one person who can and should meet the needs of my spouse, while there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of composers living right now who can touch the hearts of filmgoers with their music. Which contributions, then, are truly the most vital and significant and valuable? To me, the devoted husband and father gets the gold medal, while the film composer's best efforts are only silver or bronze. Both have worth that I value personally and for our culture, but one is clearly more vital and beautiful. Thankfully, as Bach and Handel have shown us, composers don't have to choose. But sadly, as we have seen, others have felt the choice between artistic achievement and personal integrity was inconvenient but necessary. Let me close by encouraging you to check out the film music of Jack Redford, which you're hearing right now. Jack is a friend who lives the lessons of this podcast in an exemplary manner, writing music for Hollywood movies, but knowing his actions have eternal impact, devoted first to loving his wife and raising his children. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the bad boys of classical music. As fun as it is to consider the wacky lives of some of these creative but troubled and often self-indulgent personalities, please remember that many composers lived lives devoted not only to crafting music of lasting worth, but to family, faith, and personal integrity.